Hello everyone, Shabnam Watson here. Microsoft just announced the public preview of operational databases in Microsoft Fabric. This means that you can now have your OLTP workloads in Microsoft Fabric along with the rest of the items. Essentially, you're getting access to a software as a service version of Azure SQL Database, and it is covered under the same Fabric capacity model pricing. This is a huge enabler for projects that had their analytical or data science, data engineering workloads already in Fabric, but had their operational database in a SQL database on-prem or Azure SQL database. Now they can bring those workloads into Microsoft Fabric as well. In this video, I want to show you how to use Power Apps with Fabric SQL Database, and I will also show you how to use the Power Apps visual to embed a Power Apps in a Power BI report to enable write-back scenarios. All the code that I show you today, as well as code from my previous blog posts and videos on the topic of enabling write-back, is there in the chat section of this video. All right, let's go and see how we can create a Power Apps from Fabric SQL Database first. First, let's take a quick look at my Fabric SQL database. I have some of the tables from sample AdventureWorks database that I have brought in here from my Azure SQL database. The table that I want to work with is DIM product category, and I want to create an application that can show records from this table and also let the user edit the values. So before I go to Power Apps, I need to grab the connection string for this Fabric SQL database from here. And the way to do that is to click on Open In icon up there and then choose SQL Server Management Studio. This is the connection string that I need to take with me to Power Apps. So let's go to Power Apps Studio. You start in make.powerapps.com, and then the easiest way to create an application with Power Apps if you're just getting started is to go to the Create Hub, and this will let you choose a data source and it will create a starter app for you. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to click on SQL. And the next step is to create a connection. So I'm going to choose SQL Server for the connection type. And for the authentication type, I'm going to choose Microsoft Entra ID. And this is where I need to provide the connection string. So let's go back here and copy these values and bring them over. So first, for the server name, one thing that you need to do for Power Apps is that you need to take this 1433 off, otherwise you're going to get an error message. You can leave everything else as is. And then for the database name, you want to take the whole thing. Now notice that here there's a GUID at the end of it. You need to have this GUID, whereas in the Fabric Database Explorer, you see just the first part of the name, which is the name that you give it when you create a database. But for the purpose of connecting to it, you need to have the entire GUID. So let's go in here and put the GUID in here, and then I'm going to click on Connect. This will bring up a list of the tables, and I'm going to choose DIM product category and then zoom out a little bit so that I get the connect button here, and then I'm going to click on it. And Power Apps now creates a starter application for us to work with. So let's see what it created for us. This application has 3 screens. On the first screen, there is an item called a gallery. And the way the gallery works is that you always format the first card and everything else will follow. So if you want to add a field, you can copy and paste one of these existing fields that it picked randomly on the screen, and then you can go up here to the IntelliSense and change it to a different value. So you format the first card, everything else will follow suit. So that's the main item that's on the first screen, and its property for the items is set to the same table that we gave it as the data source. Everything else that you see around here is for functionality related to this search items box to work. You don't necessarily need that for all of your applications. And the other thing that we need to pay attention to is that if you click on the navigation bar, it selects the parent, which is the gallery itself, and then on select for the gallery, it navigates to the second screen. So this is another important function for you to learn, and that is the navigation between the screens. And now this application has 2 other screens. One is a detail screen that once you click on one of the records from the gallery, it shows you all the fields in that record. And then there is an edit screen that once you click on the edit icon on the details screen, you navigate to the last screen. Now, again, this is a starter app. You don't have to have all of these screens when you create your own custom application. So let's take a look at what happens here when someone clicks on this check mark. The formula that you see here is called submit form. This is all you need to save values back to your Fabric SQL database. Power Apps is going to take care of generating that SQL for you behind the scenes and submitting it. So that's all you need. Now, before I run this application, let me just show you what's on this last page. So there is a form here that's in edit mode, and form has two important properties. One is its data source. That's where the form knows where to save data to. So when you click on this icon and you say submit form, edit form 1, the way that it works is that that form knows where to send the values to, and that is set by the data source property. The other important property that you want to pay attention to is the item. The item property of a form populates the values in the form so that when the user gets to the edit page, they don't have to enter the values from scratch. And the item property is set to browser 1 gallery selected. So whatever was selected in the first screen, when you get here, you want to work with the same record. And then finally, if someone changes their mind, we want to navigate back and go to the previous screen. So this is a very simple application. Let me go ahead and run this to show you how this works. And actually, I need to be on the first screen. So it starts from whatever screen you're on whenever you test it to preview the app. So let's go ahead and run this. So I'm going to choose this record, go to the detail. Now I can see all the values, and I'm going to go to the third screen. And this is where I can run an update statement. So if I go back to the Fabric SQL DB, you can see that accessories here has the value of accessories 44. So we're going to update this record in Power Apps and see how it works. So I'm going to change this to accessories and then click on the submit item. And this is going to run the SQL statement and update the values and also refresh the gallery here for us as well. So now let's go back to Fabric SQL DB and run the query. And you can see that it's also updated here. So when you create an application in Power Apps, you have to save it, and then you also want to publish it so that other people in your organization also have access to the same application. So from this point, you can make your application more complex, you can customize it more. You don't have to necessarily use a form to capture user entries. You can use custom set of labels and text boxes to do that, and you can use a slightly different formula to submit your changes. You can use what's called a patch function, or you can even call a stored procedure. So let me show you an example of that. So this is another application that updates the data from a sales table, and in this one you can see that I don't have a form in my second screen. I have freestanding text boxes and labels. So I've added text boxes and labels from here, and their values are still coming from what's on the gallery 1 selected item. But this time when I put a IntelliSense in front of it, I'm picking one specific column instead of giving the form all of the values. And then this particular application has its connection set to a stored procedure. And because of that, when someone clicks on the save button here, I can use this clear collect function to run my stored procedure. And then I can pass the values of those individual text boxes with the column name to the stored procedure. Okay, so this is a quick intro to using Power Apps with Fabric SQL DB, and as you saw, it's no different than creating an application that works with Azure SQL Database or on-prem SQL Database. It's very straightforward. But what I want to do next is I want to show you how to embed a Power Apps application in Power BI to enable write-back scenarios. So let's go and take a look at that. So a typical use case for write-back is that you have a Power BI report that's using a SQL data source, and it's either either in direct query or direct lake storage mode, and you want to add a Power Apps visual in it to embed a Power Apps application, and then the user will use that application to update values in the back end. And then optionally, your Power Apps visual will also refresh the Power BI page. Now, if your Power BI model is in direct query or direct lake and you trigger a Power BI page refresh, you will see the results reflected in near real time. If your Power BI model is an import, that's not going to do anything. So note that this is not a model refresh, this is a page refresh. And then when that happens, then the rest of the values on your Power BI report are also going to reflect the changes. Now, when it comes to Fabric SQL Database, you have to pay attention to a couple of things. When you create a Fabric SQL Database, you get a replicated SQL Analytics endpoint that comes with it as well. And then that replicated SQL Analytics endpoint has a semantic model that comes with it. So the way it works is that whenever you make changes to your Fabric SQL database, those changes are replicated to one lake in near real time incrementally, and then that data is reflected in the SQL Analytics endpoint. This SQL Analytics endpoint is read-only. It's meant to be for analytics. And the reason behind this is that the Fabric SQL database is your operational database in this case. And then SQL Analytics endpoint is meant to be used by your reporting applications. Now, that SQL Analytics endpoint itself has a default semantic model that's in direct lake, and it comes with it. You can also create your custom one that's in direct lake storage. And now you can point your reports to a couple of different places. So when it comes to Power Apps, the Power Apps application that's doing read and write, it must point to your Fabric SQL database because that's the only location where you can update the data. The SQL Analytics endpoint, remember that that one is read only. Now, when you update the data with your Power Apps, that data will take a few seconds to be replicated across and then for it to be available to your SQL Analytics endpoint. So if your Power BI report is built off of this SQL Analytics endpoint and you update the data and you refresh the page, there's going to be a delay until that data is available. So you may have to refresh the page a couple times, or you may have to build in some extra weight that I'm going to show you in a little bit. The first example that I want to show you is for a Power BI report that's based off of a model from the Fabric SQL database that's in direct query. So let's run this and see how it works. So I'm going to update this record, and I expect to see the results as soon as I click on the submit item. I expect to see the results also updated here without me actually refreshing the visuals manually from here. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click on submit item and see how that works. And there you go. So you see the value here updated as well as here without me hitting this refresh button manually. So how do I create this application to work with Power BI? So we're going to start with a direct query because that's the simplest. We're going to start with this direct query model because that's the simplest case. And then I'm going to go and show you how to do it with the one that's based off of the direct lake model from the SQL Analytics endpoint next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edit mode and remove this Power Apps application from here and then show you how to create one from scratch. So the first thing you need to do is to add the Power Apps visual, and from there you want to choose the values from the table that you want to be working with in Power Apps. So I'm going to choose all of my columns, and then here I can either create a new one or I can choose an app that I have previously created. Although note that the application that we previously created that was a standalone application is not going to be able to interact with our Power BI report. So that's not what we want. We want to create a new application. And once we created once from this route from Power BI service, in future, you can embed that application in other Power BI reports. But the first time you need to go in this route. So similar to before, Power Apps is going to create an application for us and have some starting items on it. But this time you're going to see that it looks a little bit different than the standalone application. And there is also an item here that's very important to us, and that's called Power BI integration. So similar to the standalone application, it put a gallery on the first screen, which is, by the way, the only screen that it created. We don't have the other screen. We're going to create that in just a few moments ourselves. But for the gallery item on this screen, if you look, its items is set to Power BI integration.data. So instead of the table that we had in the standalone application here, we're receiving our data from Power BI. Now we can edit this gallery a little bit. We can add other fields to it. So let me just add one more. And I'm doing that by doing a Control-C, Control-V. So for example, we can choose this one to be the Spanish product category name, and we can change this one to be the product category key. So just a couple of values. And then we need to add a second screen. So I can do that by going into new screen and then add a form. Okay, so this put a form here, but it's not really connected to anything. So first thing to do is to connect it to data. Remember, that's where the form is going to write its data to. So even though we're going to display data from Power BI, when it's time to update the data, it needs to have a data source. So let's go and do that. Let's choose SQL Server, add a new connection, and authentication type, like before, is going to be Microsoft Entra ID integrated. And then I'm going to click on connect. And of course, as a reminder, every time you're using a SQL data source with Power Apps, it's considered a premium data source. That means that both the person who's creating the application as well as your consumers need to have premium Power Apps licenses. So even though we're embedding it in Power BI, your users need to have Power Apps licenses as well. Okay, so this is where we're going to put the connection string, and remember that these are the same connection strings that we had before. So let me grab that and paste that in here. So here we go. This is the SQL Server name, and this is my database name. And note that I am still going after the actual Fabric SQL database itself, not the SQL Analytics endpoint. So let's connect to that. And here I'm going to get a list of tables. And by the way, before I choose the table, note that this is where you would pick a store procedure if you had a store procedure. All right, so let's go and pick the product category and connect to it. Once the connection is made, so now we can click on this icon here and connect it to that connection that we have. And then the next step is to select fields from that table. And now I can click on here and add all the fields that I want. And one more thing to do is what we want to do is we want to change the value for the key columns to be read-only so that users cannot edit those. And then you can also very easily change the order of these fields here. All right, so we have this form. What's left to do is to give it a nice title. So I'm gonna call this Save Changes. And if someone clicks on the X icon, what we want to do is we want to go back. So we want to go to the previous screen. And if someone clicks on this check mark here, we want to save the changes. Again, the form knows how to write the data back. But what we want to do is, in our case, because our model is indirect query, we have the option of seeing the results immediately as soon as the page is refreshed. So I'm calling Power BI integration.refresh, which is the same thing as the user clicking on the refresh icon in the top right corner of Power BI in Power BI service. So that's all we need from here. Now, what we want to do is we want our form to have data in it. So I'm going to go into item and set this to gallery1.selected. And that way, when the users get here, the values are going to be pre-populated. Okay, so back to screen one. I'm gonna add a text box up here to make it look a little bit nicer and give it a header. Change the font to white and change it to bold. And then for the text, I'm gonna say, choose an item to see details. And one more thing we wanna do is to set the navigation. So when someone clicks on this chevron icon, the formula up here is that it will select the parent. So when the parent, which is the gallery itself, is selected, that's where we want to put our navigation formula in. So I'm going to choose on select and say navigate screen 2. And this will navigate us to the screen 2 from the first one. I can hold down Control Alt and then I can test my application to see it's working. All right, so when I'm done with the creation of the application, the next step is to save it. And then I'm gonna publish it. You need to publish the app in order for the app to be available to other people in your organization. So you always have access to the app that you create yourself, but you must publish it for other people to see your application. Okay, so now that I'm done in Power Apps Studio, I'm going to navigate back to my report, and as you're going to see, it's going to populate the application for me in here. Let's see if this application works. So let's choose this bikes 2222 and see how it works. So again, we expect this to update the values on the visuals without me clicking on this icon here. So we did not click on that. All right, so this is a sample for how to use Power Apps in Power BI using the Power Apps visual to enable Writeback when the model is in direct query. Next, I'm going to show you how to work with a model that's in direct lake storage mode. Remember that your model can be built off of the SQL Analytics endpoint. And when you're building a model off of the SQL Analytics endpoint, you have the option of either importing the data into Power BI's memory or using direct query, which means the data stays in your backend and you're just displaying the results in Power BI, or you can use direct lake. Now, with either direct query or direct lake, a page refresh in Power BI is going to show you the results that are updated in the SQL Analytics endpoint in near real time. However, remember that in our case, when the Power Apps is updating the Fabric SQL database itself, there is a little bit of time before that change is reflected into the SQL Analytics endpoint because it's being replicated. There's a short delay. So because of that, a page refresh may not show the results to the user immediately. Now, that may or may not be use case for your end users. If it is required for them to wait and see the changes, then I will show you in the next application how to implement that wait. Here's a Power BI report that's built off of the default semantic model from the SQL Analytics endpoint of my Fabric SQL database. Now, let me show you how this works. The model is in direct lake. So if I use the Power Apps to make updates to it, so let me change this to a different number, you're going to see that a quick page refresh is not going to show me the changes. So when I click on submit item, the application updates the data in the backend and a page refresh is actually triggered. However, I don't see the changes yet. That's because there's a little bit of delay for those changes to show up. So if I go here and manually click on refresh visuals, that's when after a few seconds, I'm gonna see the changes. So let me try that again. And here it goes. So it took 2 attempts by clicking on the refresh button up here for the results to come back. So there is a delay of a few seconds, maybe up to 30 seconds for the changes to be reflected. So depending on the use case, we can insert a wait into our Power Apps. Again, a lot of times the use cases are that somebody wants to update values, but they don't need to see the changes immediately. It's okay to wait for the next page refresh or when someone navigates between different report pages for the changes to come back. However, if you have the requirement to see the changes as the person is making them in Power Apps and you want to make them wait, then that's the next thing that I'm gonna show you. So here's a Power BI report that's built off of the default semantic model of the SQL Analytics endpoint of Fabric SQL Database. And in here, I have introduced a wait time. So if I update this record, you're going to see that once I click on here, there's going to be a graphic that's going to show up that's going to tell the user that mirroring is in progress or replicating is in progress. Now, the amount of time for this visual is hard-coded to 30 seconds. That may or may not be the correct amount of time to wait in all use cases. And you can make this more advanced from here. You can check and see if the results have been updated and then take the visual away. But that's not what I'm going to show you right now. So for now, we're going to just learn how to hard code the value of the wait to a certain amount of time. Okay, so you see that went away, and then now our page refresh actually reflected the results back. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code behind this application. So I'm going to edit the Power BI report and then edit the visual. So this is going to take me to Power Apps Studio with the application connected to my Power BI report so that it has data that I can work with. Otherwise, when you get to Power Apps, if you go directly to Power Apps Studio to edit your application, you will not have your data to work with. You can change some things like the fonts and the colors. However, if you want to see the data, it's important that you start from Power BI service. Okay, so on this application, I still have the gallery like before, and on the second screen, I also still have a form. So this is a form and its data source is set to the same table as before, and its item is coming from gallery 1 selected, just like before. What's different here is that I'm not using that check mark to save the changes, but this time I'm using a save button. And in the save button, if I show you the code, you're going to see that I set a couple of variables in here. The first 2 lines, I am setting some variables in PowerFX. These variables control the visibility of my save button and the visibility of that show progress image that I have. And then this is where the actual write happens. So we're going to submit the changes to the backend, and then I use this code to set up a timer. So I have a timer on the screen and it is hidden. So let me toggle this so that you can see that. So there's a timer down here and it is hidden. Now the timer in Power Apps is a little bit different than a timer that you may have seen in other programming languages. So in order to start it, you have to toggle some settings and it will start. And so to do that, on my application, I have set those variables that you saw in here. So whenever someone clicks on the save button here, I set these parameters so that they toggle the timer so that the timer gets started. And then if you look at the timer again, you can see that its duration in my case is actually set to 40 seconds. And if you look down here, whenever the timer ends, that's when I will make the image's visibility to toggle to false. So we want that graphic to go away. We want our save button to be activated again. And then this is where I trigger the page refresh. So I wait for the changes to finish before I refresh my page, and then I go back to the first screen. Now, a couple of other properties on the timer are important. So we have the duration and on timer end, but there's also these two. So start is set to timer go, which was one of the variables that I showed you previously. And then reset is set to reset timer. And also whenever you navigate to the second screen, so on second screen on visible or on hidden, I will also toggle these parameters to make sure that everything is ready to go. So I showed you a couple of different options for creating a Power Apps in Power BI to enable Writeback. When it comes to your Power BI model, depending on whether you point it to your Fabric SQL database or the SQL Analytics endpoint, that has implications for when the users are going to see the changes that you make with your Power Apps. And also the table storage mode that you choose for your Power BI tables has an implications on that as well. So you have to pay attention to all of these. The first example that I showed you, both the Power Apps and Power BI were pointing to the Fabric SQL database itself. So whenever someone made changes in Power Apps, we could use Power Apps to also refresh the Power BI page, and that way the users could see the changes immediately. Now, this may or may not be a use case for your project. For example, if you're working with a high demand operational database, then it may not be a good idea to point your Power BI reports to that operational database. Typically, projects that are working with a high demand operational database want to separate out their analytical layer, and that's when you could use the SQL Analytics endpoint, or you can use another instance of Fabric SQL DB for your higher levels of silver and gold so that you are separating out your workload. So this is also an option for you. With the other examples that I showed you, Power Apps was working off of Fabric SQL Database itself. However, the Power BI model was working off of the SQL Analytics endpoint. Now, I use the default semantic model that's in Direct Lake, but you can also create a custom one that's in Direct Lake as well. And in this scenario, whenever you make changes with Power Apps, the changes are made to your SQL DB, and there is a little bit of time before those are replicated over to the SQL Analytics endpoint and reflected in your Power BI report. So depending on your use case, you can build in some wait time into your application to make the user wait. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please check out the comment section for links to my other content, as well as a blog post that is on the same topic that I showed you today in this video. And please like and subscribe for future content.